He used to wake up every morning to the sound of birds on the windowsill and the faint hum of a piano in the corner. The piano had been with him longer than most people in his life. Its keys were faded, some chipped, but when his fingers touched them, the world always felt a little more gentle. Music had been his language long before words could ever describe what was in his heart. For as long as he could remember, he believed that if he kept playing, he could hold on to the best parts of life: love, laughter, and peace. When he was young, he worked as a music teacher in a small school. He never made much money, but he didn't care. What mattered most to him was the joy in the children's faces when they hit the right note or played their first song all the way through. He would sit beside them, smile softly, and whisper, "Music is not about getting it perfect. It's about feeling it." In his younger days, his home was small but filled with warmth. There was a garden where his wife grew flowers and a tiny living room where his piano sat. Every evening he played for her, sometimes soft tunes when she felt tired, sometimes bright and joyful ones when she was in the mood to dance. They never had much, but they had love, and that seemed to make everything enough. But time has a quiet way of changing everything. His wife fell sick one winter, and the house that once echoed with laughter turned silent. He cared for her as best as he could, holding her hand when she was too weak to speak. The day she passed away, he sat at the piano for hours, pressing the same 3 notes again and again as if somehow they could bring her back. After that, he never played the piano the same way. The songs were slower, heavier, filled with longing instead of joy. His children had grown up and moved away by then. They had their own families, their own lives. At first they called every week, then once a month, then only on holidays. Soon even those calls stopped. He tried to stay positive. He told himself they were just busy, that young people always had a lot to do. He waited for them every Sunday, making tea and setting out extra cups just in case someone decided to visit. But no one did. The silence became a companion he learned to live with. Years passed and his body grew weaker. Bills started piling up, and the small pension he received barely covered the basics. The house that had once been a home became too big, too empty, too heavy to care for. When he could no longer afford the rent, he tried reaching out to his children. He left messages, wrote letters, even tried calling late at night when he thought they might pick up. But his calls went unanswered. One morning, a man came to the door with papers in hand and told him he had to leave. The property was being sold and he needed to move out. He stood there quietly, nodding as the words hit him one by one. He didn't argue. He didn't beg. He just looked around the room, the walls that once held his family's laughter, the piano that had been his closest friend, and whispered, "I'll take the piano." It took him hours to move it. The piano was heavy and old, but he couldn't leave it behind. It was all he had left. With ropes, a cart, and sheer determination, he pushed it down the street. Passers-by looked at him with pity, some with confusion, but he kept going. Every step hurt, every breath felt like lifting a mountain, but he couldn't stop. The piano wasn't just wood and strings. It was his life, his memories, his last connection to the world that once loved him. That night he found an empty space beneath an old bridge. The air was cold and the ground was hard, but it was quiet. He covered himself with an old blanket and rested his hand on the piano, as if it were a friend watching over him. The sound of cars passing above became his lullaby. For the first time in his long life, he was homeless. At sunrise, he woke up stiff and shivering. His stomach ached from hunger, but his heart told him to play. He lifted the cover and placed his fingers on the keys. The sound was rough at first, the piano slightly out of tune, but soon the melody found its way out. The notes echoed under the bridge, soft and lonely, yet strangely beautiful. People walking by stopped to listen. Some smiled, some dropped a few coins, others just stood there quietly, letting the music wrap around them. For the first time in months, he felt seen again, not as an old man with nowhere to go, but as someone who still had something to give. Every note became a way to tell his story, of love, loss, and survival. Children sometimes came close to watch, their faces filled with curiosity. He would smile and say, "Do you hear that? That's not just sound. That's life speaking." Days turned into weeks, and the space under the bridge began to feel like home. He cleaned the area around his piano, set up a small stool, and played every day from sunrise to sunset. People started recognizing him, the man with the piano. They brought him food, warm clothes, and sometimes just stopped to talk. Even though he had nothing, he gave everyone something they didn't expect: peace, hope, a little reminder that kindness still existed. At night, when the city went quiet, he would close his eyes and think about his wife. He would imagine her sitting beside him again, humming softly as he played. Sometimes he whispered her name as if she could still hear him through the music, and maybe in some way she did. He didn't hold anger toward his family. He had long stopped waiting for them to come back. Instead, he found a strange kind of comfort in the people who stopped to listen. They became his new family, strangers who shared a moment of stillness in the noise of the world. He didn't know their names, but their smiles were enough. Even as the weather turned harsh, he refused to leave his piano. When it rained, he covered it with plastic sheets. When it snowed, he brushed the keys clean before playing. Some people told him to go to a shelter, but he always said, "As long as I can play, I'm not lost." Sometimes he looked at his hands, old, trembling, the veins showing like rivers beneath his skin, and wondered how much longer they could move. Yet every morning, they still found the strength to create music. Each song was a prayer, not for himself, but for everyone who had ever felt forgotten. He didn't think of himself as a homeless man. He thought of himself as a musician without a stage. The city streets were his audience, the open sky his ceiling. There was freedom in that, a kind of quiet dignity that no one could take away. And though he didn't know it, his story was only beginning. Somewhere in the crowd, someone was about to notice him, not just as an old man playing piano, but as a living reminder of how love and art can survive even when everything else is gone. That morning, as the sun rose and the first golden light touched the piano keys, he played one of his favorite songs. The tune floated through the air, wrapping around the city like a warm blanket. People slowed down to listen. Some took videos on their phones, not knowing that what they were capturing wasn't just music. It was a man's heart speaking to the world, one note at a time. He smiled to himself, eyes half closed, and whispered, "Still here." The cold was cruel that winter. The wind cut through the cracks under the bridge, and every night felt longer than the one before. The old man wrapped himself in layers of worn blankets, trying to keep warm. His fingers, once graceful and strong, had started to stiffen from the chill. But even when his hands trembled, he still played. He always played. Some nights when the streets were quiet, he could hear the faint echo of his own music bouncing off the concrete walls. It was a lonely sound, but it gave him strength. It reminded him that he was still alive. Every morning before the city fully woke up, he cleaned around his piano. He had a small routine: brush off the dust, check if the strings were still in tune, wipe the keys with a soft cloth he had found in a donation box. It wasn't much, but it made him feel human again, like he still had a purpose. People began to recognize him more. Some would bring him food or coffee. Others just stood for a few minutes to listen before rushing off to work. One woman who passed by every day started leaving small notes on the piano. Sometimes it was a simple "thank you for the music." Other times, it was a few words of encouragement like, "Your songs make my mornings better." He didn't know her name, but those little notes became something he looked forward to. They reminded him that kindness still existed, that there were still people who noticed. One afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the tall buildings, a group of children stopped near the piano. They were laughing and curious. One boy pointed and said, "Can you play something happy?" The old man smiled and nodded. He lifted his fragile hands and began to play a lively tune. The children clapped along, their laughter echoing through the street. For a few minutes, the world didn't feel so heavy. When he finished, one of the kids handed him a small sandwich and said shyly, "My mom said to give this to you." The old man thanked them softly, his eyes shining with gratitude. That small act of kindness filled his heart more than any meal ever could. As the days passed, more people came to listen. Some recorded his performances on their phones. Others stopped to talk. A few even asked about his story, but he rarely shared much. It wasn't that he didn't want to. It was just that the memories still hurt. Talking about his past felt like reopening an old wound that never healed. But there was one young man who kept coming back. He carried a camera and always asked if he could film. At first, the old man refused. He didn't want to be someone's project or video for attention. But the young man was patient. He sat quietly, listened, and never pushed. He always brought coffee, and sometimes they would just talk, not about the past but about music, about life, about simple things. One morning after a long silence, the old man finally said yes. The young man set up his camera while the old man played his favorite song, a slow, emotional tune that carried the weight of a lifetime. His fingers trembled as he pressed the keys, but the sound that came out was pure and filled with soul. When the song ended, the young man was quiet for a while. Then he said softly, "That was beautiful. People need to hear this." The old man didn't really understand what he meant. He just nodded, smiled faintly, and went back to fixing a loose key on the piano. A few days later, something strange happened. More and more people started showing up at the bridge. They carried flowers, blankets, and food. Some even cried when they saw him. The young man came running with his camera, excited and breathless. "You're all over the internet," he said. "Your video went viral. Millions of people have seen it." The old man blinked, confused. "Viral?" he asked. "Is that bad?" The young man laughed. "No, it means the world knows about you now. They love your music. They love your story." The old man didn't quite know what to say. For years he had lived in silence, unseen and forgotten. Now suddenly strangers were calling him an inspiration. People came from far away just to hear him play. Some even brought their own instruments and joined him for small street performances. The bridge that once felt like a place of sadness had become a place of connection. Every day new faces appeared. They listened, sang along, and shared stories of their own struggles. Some said his music helped them through hard times. Others said they hadn't smiled in months until they heard him play. The old man didn't know how to handle all the attention. He was grateful, but he still lived simply. He refused to leave his piano, even when people offered to find him a home. He always said, "This piano has been my home for years. It never left me, so I won't leave it." But deep inside he felt something changing. For the first time in a long while he felt seen. Not as a homeless man, not as someone abandoned, but as a human being who still had something to give. One evening a reporter came to interview him. She asked, "Do you have any message for the people who are watching your videos?" He thought for a moment, then smiled gently. "Tell them to listen to each other more. The world forgets people who are quiet, but everyone has a song inside them. You just have to stop and hear it." His words touched hearts everywhere. Messages poured in from around the world. People sent letters, drawings, and donations. A few local charities even offered to help him find a safe place to stay. Still, he stayed by his piano. When asked why, he simply said, "It's where my memories live." As the days grew warmer, he played longer. The music grew lighter, happier. People said he looked younger, brighter. Maybe it was the joy of being noticed again. Maybe it was the power of connection. One day, while he was playing, an older woman approached him slowly. She stood quietly, listening, her eyes full of tears. When the song ended, she whispered, "I used to come to your concerts. You played at my school when I was a child." He looked at her in surprise. He hadn't heard someone say that in decades. She smiled through her tears and added, "You taught me to love music." He nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "Then I guess I did something right," he said softly. Moments like that reminded him why he never gave up. The piano had saved him, yes, but it had also saved others. It was more than an instrument. It was a bridge between hearts, connecting strangers through something beyond words. Still, he knew his body was getting weaker. His hands sometimes froze in mid-song, his breathing heavier than before. But he didn't let it stop him. He believed that as long as he could play, he still had purpose. Some nights, when the crowd was gone, he sat alone and thought about his family. He wondered if they had seen the videos, if they remembered him, if they were proud. There was no anger anymore, just quiet acceptance. He didn't blame them for leaving. Life moves fast. People forget. But he had found peace in knowing that his music had reached far beyond what he ever imagined. One night, as he played under the streetlights, the young man with the camera returned. He said softly, "There's a community center that wants you to come play for them. They'll take care of you. You'd have a warm room, food, everything." The old man looked at his piano, then back at the young man. He smiled. "I'll think about it," he said, but deep down he knew. He wasn't ready to leave the streets yet. The city had become his audience and the bridge his stage. Every face that stopped to listen reminded him that he still mattered. That night, the young man packed up his camera and said, "You've changed more lives than you know." The old man chuckled softly. "I didn't change anyone," he said. "The music did." And then he played, slow, gentle, full of heart. The sound drifted into the night, rising above the noise of the city. People stopped. They listened. Some closed their eyes. Others smiled. In that moment, the old man wasn't homeless or forgotten or broken. He was simply what he had always been, a musician sharing his soul through the keys of an old piano, proving that no matter how much time passes, the human spirit can still shine through the darkest corners of the world. Days slowly turned into months, and the man by the bridge became a familiar face in the city. People who used to hurry past that old piano now stopped for a few moments each day. Some smiled, some cried, and others simply stood still, letting the music sink into their hearts. The sound had a way of quieting the noise around them. The young man who had first recorded his song kept visiting, bringing updates from the online world. "You're everywhere," he would say with excitement. "People are calling you the man who plays hope." The old man would just smile and shake his head. "Hope," he'd whisper, almost as if testing how the word felt after so many years of loneliness. His simple life continued beneath that same bridge. He had a small space covered with blankets and cardboard to block the cold wind. People left food and clothes and sometimes a few dollars, but he never asked for anything. All he wanted was to keep his piano close. Each day he played as if it might be his last. His fingers, though thin and shaky, still carried grace. Every note he played told a story. Of loss, of endurance, of love that never died. He became a symbol for something people couldn't quite explain. Some said his music made them remember their parents or grandparents. Others said it helped them forgive someone they hadn't spoken to in years. His songs carried emotions words couldn't capture. One morning the city woke to heavy rain. The streets flooded quickly and water began to rise beneath the bridge. The old man tried to lift his piano onto the cart he used, but it was too heavy. He pulled and pushed with all his strength, but his weak body couldn't fight against the rushing water. Just when it seemed the piano would be lost, two strangers appeared. They were young, both soaked from head to toe. Without hesitation, they rushed in to help. Together, they managed to move the piano to higher ground. The old man sat down, breathing heavily. His eyes glistened with tears as he looked at the piano, safe once again. One of the young men said, "You should come with us. There's a shelter nearby." He shook his head slowly. "No, I stay where the music is." They looked at him for a long moment, then nodded, understanding in their eyes. Before they left, one of them took off his jacket and placed it over the old man's shoulders. "Stay warm," he said softly. That night, after the rain stopped, the old man played again. The sound was soft, full of gratitude. People who passed by said it was the most beautiful song they had ever heard, one that made them stop and close their eyes without even realizing it. The next morning, something extraordinary happened. A van pulled up near the bridge, and out came a group of people carrying cameras and microphones. The young filmmaker ran ahead, grinning. "They're making a documentary about you," he said. "Your story has touched millions." The old man didn't quite understand what a documentary was, but he smiled politely. They asked him questions about his past, his music, and what kept him going all these years. He answered slowly in short sentences, always with kindness. When one of them asked, "What do you want most in the world?" he thought for a long moment before replying, "Just to play one more song tomorrow." The crew was silent. That answer said more than any long speech ever could. In the weeks that followed, donations poured in. People sent money, messages, and even offers to give him a new home. One letter came from a faraway country, written in shaky handwriting. It said, "Your music made me believe in life again." The old man didn't know how to reply, but he held that letter close. It reminded him that even small acts, a song, a smile, a kind word, could change the world. Still, he stayed by his piano. It was his anchor, his reason to wake up each morning. Sometimes he'd whisper to it as if talking to an old friend. "We made it again," he'd say softly after each long day. The young filmmaker started bringing other musicians to play with him, a violinist, a singer, a guitarist. They performed together right there under the bridge. The small crowd that gathered every day grew bigger. People brought folding chairs, children danced, and for those few hours the city didn't feel so cold. One evening, a little girl approached him with her mother. She was holding a small toy piano. "I want to play like you someday," she said shyly. The old man smiled and reached out his wrinkled hand. Then never stop listening, he told her. Music lives in your heart first. Her mother wiped a tear from her eye as they walked away. The old man's health was starting to fade. Some mornings his hands wouldn't move as easily. Other times he'd cough so hard it hurt. But no matter how weak he felt, he always made his way to the piano. If I can still play, I'm still alive, he often said. One cold evening he sat quietly before touching the keys. The young filmmaker noticed and asked, "Are you all right?" The old man nodded slowly. "Just thinking about how lucky I am," he said. "I used to think I had nothing. But now I see I have everything that matters. Music, kindness, and people who listen." That night he played one of his most powerful songs yet. Slow, deep, almost like a prayer. The people listening didn't move or speak. When the last note faded, there was a silence so complete that even the city seemed to pause. Then slowly applause filled the air along with a few tears and smiles. The next morning, the young filmmaker arrived early and found the old man sitting quietly beside his piano, watching the sunrise. "You should really come with me to the community center today," he said gently. "They've prepared something special." After a long pause, the old man nodded. "All right. But the piano comes too." They helped load the piano onto a truck and drove to the center. Inside, dozens of people were waiting. Children, elders, musicians, and reporters. They clapped when he entered. The young filmmaker guided him to the front and said, "Everyone here came because your music changed their lives." The old man looked around, overwhelmed. He didn't know what to say. A woman from the center stepped forward and said, "We wanted to thank you, and we have something for you." Behind her, a curtain opened to reveal his piano, cleaned, polished, and beautifully restored. The broken keys were replaced, the wood shined, and it looked almost new again. He gasped softly, his trembling hands covering his mouth. "You fixed it," he whispered. The woman nodded. "It's yours always. We just wanted to give it a new life, just like you gave new life to so many of us." Tears filled his eyes as he walked up to the piano and touched the keys. "It sounds young again," he said with a smile. When he played, the sound filled the room like sunlight. The children clapped, people hugged, and laughter mixed with music. It was no longer just a performance. It was a celebration of everything he had endured. That night, the young filmmaker helped him settle into a small room at the center. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm and safe. There was a bed, a heater, and a window that looked out onto the street where he used to play. Before sleeping, the old man sat by the window, looking at the stars. The city lights reflected on the glass, and in that quiet moment he whispered, "Thank you for listening." He knew his life was reaching its final chapter, but he wasn't afraid. The loneliness that once filled his heart had been replaced by peace. The piano had saved him once, and now through it, he had saved others too. As he drifted to sleep, a soft smile lingered on his face. The piano rested just a few feet away, its keys gleaming under the moonlight. It seemed to breathe quietly beside him, as if keeping him company, the faithful friend that never left, the voice that carried his soul when words failed. The days at the community center passed quietly, but for the old man they felt full and meaningful. He now had a warm bed to sleep in, a roof over his head, and a piano that sounded new again. Every morning he would wake up before sunrise, sit by the window, and watch the light spill across the city. It was the same city that had once ignored him, but now it was also the city that had rediscovered him. He still played every day, just as he had done beneath the bridge. But now, instead of cold wind and concrete walls, there were smiling faces, children's laughter, and the sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway. His piano stood in the center's main room, surrounded by chairs where people often gathered to listen. The first week, only a few people came to hear him play. The next week, the room filled completely. Some were locals who had followed his story online. Others were strangers who had simply heard that an old man with a piano was changing lives through music. He never charged anyone, never asked for anything in return. All he wanted was to keep sharing what had saved him. "Music gave me my breath back," he told one of the volunteers. "So now I just share the air." The young filmmaker still visited often. He had become almost like family to the old man. He brought updates from people who had seen the documentary, letters from across the world, and sometimes even small gifts. A warm scarf, a framed photo, or a new set of piano keys. The old man always accepted them with a humble smile, thanking each person as if they had given him the world. One afternoon, the community center hosted a small event to celebrate him. There were candles, snacks, and a banner that read, "Thank you for the music." When he walked in and saw the crowd waiting, his eyes filled with tears. He hadn't seen that many people gathered for him since his younger days. They asked him to play something special. He sat at the piano, took a deep breath, and began to play the same song he used to play for his wife many years ago. The melody was gentle, filled with love and longing. The room fell silent, and by the time he finished, several people were quietly wiping away tears. After the performance, a man from the local news approached him. "Your story has inspired people around the world," he said. "Would you like to travel, maybe share your music in other places?" The old man smiled and shook his head. "This is my home now. My music belongs here to these people." He wasn't chasing fame or recognition. For him, the simple act of being heard, of being seen, was enough. The following weeks brought new changes. The center began music classes for children, inspired by his story. He agreed to teach them, though he joked that his fingers weren't as quick as they used to be. Every afternoon, the room filled with small hands pressing piano keys, laughter echoing through the air. He would walk slowly among them, offering gentle words of guidance. "Don't just play with your fingers," he would tell them. "Play with your heart. Let your feelings come out through the sound." The children adored him. They brought him small drawings of pianos and music notes, taped them on the wall, and called him Grandpa Music. It made him laugh every time. One day, a group of students from a nearby university came to interview him for a project. They asked, "What's the secret to happiness?" He paused for a moment, then said softly, "Don't hold on to what hurts. Hold on to what sings." His simple words touched everyone who heard them. The interview spread online, adding even more warmth to his growing legacy. But even as joy filled his days, the old man knew that his body was growing weaker. Climbing stairs made him tired. His hands shook more often, and sometimes his chest felt heavy when he played for too long. Still, he never complained. Whenever someone asked how he felt, he would smile and say, "I'm just thankful I can still touch the keys." One night, he sat by the window with the young filmmaker. The lights of the city flickered outside. "Did you ever think your story would reach so many people?" the young man asked. The old man chuckled quietly. "I never thought my story mattered. I was just trying to stay alive. But maybe that's what people needed to see. That even when everything is gone, you can still choose to make something beautiful." They sat in silence for a while, watching the city move below them. The filmmaker finally said, "There's a music festival coming up. They want you to perform just one song." The old man's eyes widened slightly. "A festival for me?" He hesitated. The idea of performing in front of thousands of people felt almost unreal. It had been decades since he'd played on a stage. He thought about it for a few days, unsure if he was strong enough. But one morning, he looked at his piano and said softly, "Let's do it, old friend." The news spread quickly. The organizers promised to bring his piano from the center so he could play on stage. They even planned a tribute to his life, a short film showing his journey from the streets to where he was now. When the day of the festival arrived, the old man was nervous. He wore a simple suit donated by someone from the center and a scarf knitted by one of the children. The young filmmaker stood beside him, offering reassurance. "They're waiting for you," he said with a smile. As he stepped onto the stage, a wave of applause filled the air. The lights were bright, and for a moment it all felt like a dream. He sat at his piano, took a deep breath, and looked at the crowd. There were faces from every age, every background. People who had come to hear not just his music, but his story. He began to play. The first notes were soft, almost trembling, but soon the melody found its strength. It was a song about life, the pain, the beauty, the forgiveness. Every sound carried emotion, every pause felt like a heartbeat. The audience was silent. Many had tears in their eyes. When he finished, the applause was thunderous. People stood, clapping and cheering, shouting words of love and gratitude. The old man smiled, his eyes glistening under the lights. He stood slowly, placed his hand on the piano, and said into the microphone, "This piano was my only friend when I had no one. It gave me a reason to wake up every morning. If you ever feel lost, find something that keeps your heart alive and never let it go." The crowd erupted again. their cheers echoing through the night. After the performance, many people came up to meet him. They thanked him for his courage, for his music, for reminding them what it meant to truly live. A few even told him that his story had helped them mend broken relationships with their own families. Later that night, as he sat backstage, the young filmmaker handed him a photo, a picture of him playing at the bridge from years ago, when his clothes were torn and his face tired. "You've come a long way," he said softly. The old man looked at the picture for a long time. "Yes," he whispered. But the music never changed. It was always the same. They both smiled quietly. When they returned to the community center, the children were waiting with balloons and drawings. They had stayed up late to welcome him home. "Grandpa Music, you did it!" they shouted. He laughed, his heart full. For the first time in many years, he felt completely surrounded by love. Not because of fame or recognition, but because people had opened their hearts to him and he to them. That night, he sat by his piano one last time before bed. The room was dim, the air peaceful. He touched the keys lightly and played a soft lullaby. His hands moved slowly, each note falling like a whisper. When the song ended, he closed his eyes and smiled. "We did good, didn't we?" he said quietly to the piano. The instrument seemed to glow faintly in the light, standing tall and proud beside him. The same piano that had carried him through the streets, the storms and the silence. The morning after the festival was calm and quiet. Sunlight slipped gently through the window, touching the old man's face as he opened his eyes. The world outside was already awake, the sound of traffic, people walking, and birds calling in the distance. He sat up slowly, feeling the familiar stiffness in his body, but a peaceful smile spread across his face. He had done it. He had played again, one last time before a crowd of thousands. People had clapped, cried, and stood in awe. For a man who once slept under a bridge with nothing but an old piano, it felt like a miracle. But to him, it wasn't about the fame. It was about connection. Music had once again proven its quiet power, to heal, to bring people together, to make strangers feel like family. The community center had become his true home. The people there cared for him like he was their own grandfather. Every morning, one of the children would bring him tea, and he would thank them with a soft smile and a few gentle notes on the piano. Sometimes he would hum along, his voice low and shaky but full of life. The young filmmaker still came by often. He had become almost like a grandson to him. He brought updates from the outside world, how the festival performance had gone viral, how people across countries were talking about the old man and his piano, how schools were using his story to teach kindness. The old man would listen quietly, his eyes shining but humble as ever. "I never thought my life would reach so far," he said one morning, after hearing about a new video that had millions of views. "It's strange, isn't it? You can live nearly 100 years and still find a new reason to wake up." He spent most of his days teaching music to the children at the center. It became his greatest joy. He no longer cared for applause or attention. He cared about seeing those small fingers press the right keys, seeing the spark of pride light up in their eyes. "That's it," he would whisper when they got it right. "You see? You can speak without words." He often told them that music wasn't just about sound, it was about heart. "Even if you play just one note," he would say, "if you mean it, people will feel it." The children adored him. They drew him pictures of pianos and rainbows and taped them all over the wall. When he walked into the room, they shouted his name with joy. That energy filled him with warmth that no amount of fame or money could ever replace. But time, as always, moved forward. His hands began to slow down. Some days he couldn't play for long. His back hurt and his breathing grew shallow. The staff at the center noticed, and they gently encouraged him to rest more. He would nod, agree, and then still sneak back to the piano when the room was quiet. One night, the young filmmaker found him sitting there, playing softly under the dim light. "You should be resting," he said kindly. The old man smiled without stopping his song. "I rest when I play," he said. "The music carries me where sleep cannot." The young man sat beside him and listened. It was a slow tune, tender and full of emotion. When it ended, they both sat in silence for a moment. The old man looked at the piano and said quietly, "It's funny. I used to think this piano was what kept me alive. But now I realize it wasn't the piano. It was the people. It was kindness. That's what saved me." The young man nodded, his throat tight with emotion. A few weeks later, the community center held a small concert. This time it wasn't for the old man. It was for the children he had taught. They wanted to play for him. The stage was simple, decorated with handmade paper stars and a sign that read, "For Grandpa and his music." He sat in the front row, wrapped in a blanket, watching proudly as each child took their turn at the piano. They played softly, carefully, their little fingers pressing the keys with all the love and care he had taught them. At the end of the performance, the children stood together and sang a simple song they had written for him. Their voices were clear and pure, echoing through the hall. "You showed us how to listen. You showed us how to care through every note and every sound. Your heart was always there." By the end of the song, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. The old man clapped slowly, tears rolling down his cheeks. He whispered, "Beautiful, so beautiful." After the event, the young filmmaker walked him back to his room. The night was quiet, the moon hanging low in the sky. "You've done so much," the young man said softly. "Your story has changed lives." The old man smiled. "Maybe," he said, "but I didn't plan any of it. I just kept playing." That night, he sat by the window for a long time. The city below glittered like a sea of stars. He thought about everything: his wife, his children, the home he had lost, the bridge, the kindness of strangers, and this new family he had found. He felt peace, deep, quiet peace. He turned to his piano, running his fingers gently across the keys. "Thank you," he whispered. "You never left me." He played one final song. It was soft, almost like a whisper, a melody full of memories. Each note seemed to carry a piece of his soul. The sound drifted through the center, down the hallways, out the open window, into the night. The next morning, when the sunlight touched the room, the young filmmaker came to visit as usual. He knocked softly but didn't hear an answer. When he entered, the old man was sitting by his piano, his head resting gently against it, a peaceful smile still on his face. The piano key beneath his hand was pressed down, holding the last note he ever played. There was no sadness in the room, only silence, and the faint echo of music that seemed to linger in the air. The center held a small ceremony for him a few days later. People came from all over, strangers who had heard his music, children he had taught, the staff who had cared for him, and even the young man who had shared his story with the world. The restored piano stood at the front of the room, surrounded by flowers. The young filmmaker stepped forward and spoke quietly. "He once told me that music isn't about sound, it's about heart. And I think that's what he left behind for us, a piece of his heart, in every note he ever played." After the ceremony, the children gathered around the piano. One by one, they each pressed a key, letting a single note ring out. Together, those sounds formed a melody, not planned, not perfect, but full of love, and somehow, everyone felt as though he was still there, smiling, listening, maybe even playing along from somewhere beyond. In the following weeks, the community center built a small plaque beside the piano. It read, "For the man who played through every storm. You showed us that music is another way to live." The piano stayed where it was, never moved again. People who visited the center often stopped to touch it, as if greeting an old friend. Some said that if you sat close enough on a quiet night, you could still hear faint notes drifting through the room, like the sound of a soft lullaby, carried by the wind. The young filmmaker finished his documentary soon after. It was called The Man and the Piano. It told the story of resilience, love, and the simple beauty of never giving up. The film went on to win awards around the world, but he always said the real reward was the message it carried. In one interview, he said, "He didn't just teach us about music. He taught us about being human, about hope, forgiveness, and how a single act of kindness can change everything." Years later, the community center still held a music day every year in his honor. The children who had once learned from him grew up and taught others. The sound of the piano never stopped echoing through that hall, and though the man himself was gone, his spirit remained, not just in the songs, but in every smile, every helping hand, every quiet act of love that came after. He had once been forgotten, left with nothing but a broken piano and a fragile dream, but through his music he became a voice for those who had none, a light for those who had lost their way. The world remembered him not as a homeless man or a forgotten soul, but as something much greater, a symbol of what it means to be truly alive.